I am holding in my hands the frontis material for the fiscal year 2019 budget, which was released yesterday by the Trump administration. And budget blueprints are notoriously unreliable because essentially it's just a fantasy of what the president, given absolute control to direct government to his whim, would do. Obviously, once Congress gets their hands on the budget, different priorities are going to enter and funding is going to become quite different. But what the frontis material, which is usually essentially the president's propagandistic spin on his budget, along with some directives from the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney in this case, attempt to sell to critics and to the American people exactly why this is a good fit for government. And rhetorically, these are interesting documents because they reveal a lot about the inner workings of the president's mind, and they tell you what, given absolute power, they would do and how they see government as acting, what they think is within government's interest, what the priority of its power should be, and what kind of a role it should play in citizens' lives. So we're just going to go through the president's address because he lists what he calls his pillars of reform. So this is a fantastic view into what unfortunately is a highly nationalist, populist mindset that the president has. In short, there's not a lot that the president doesn't think that government should do. Now, he begins by saying that in the past year, we have boosted economic growth, created more than 2 million jobs, and added nearly 5 trillion in new wealth to the stock market. Now, this "we" is problematic, right? We went from a president who said, "You didn't build that," to a president who's now saying, "We built that," which is essentially the same thing, even though it's worded differently. There's this idea that achievement happens through the collective. It happens because government is there to help you. And this is just so antithetical to traditional American ideas about government and society. The idea that government is limited means that there is a largely unlimited or very barely regulated private sphere in which individuals have freedom to act. And it's in this sphere that they act in pursuance of their own good. They might form bonds with people who have things that they need and who can help them accomplish their goals. But again, this is done largely through their own discretion because they actively seek out and identify and pursue those individuals and create deals with them. Government gets involved only when conflict arises, only when one actor steps on another's toes. So this idea that, one, the economy is something that grows because government has fostered it is problematic, and this idea that we, meaning essentially you and the government, have boosted growth, have created jobs, have done all these things, is just fallacious, really, and so counter to the traditional American mindset. And you can say that maybe this view, which Obama shared, which President Trump shared, and they're not alone. Certainly, you can go back and look at various strains of populism throughout American history. The progressives in particular are big on this idea of we do things together. But it's not the founding mindset of America. Is it now the mindset of America? Maybe. I still think it's problematic. All right, and so then we get into the pillars of reform, and the first of these is ending wasteful spending, which is pretty hilarious because this budget proposal does not balance over 10 years. It adds to the deficit. It significantly increases spending, in particular, not just the continuing resolution that passed as part of that, but this $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill is part of that too. And the president writes that ending wasteful spending is something that we should think about because, quote, the budget makes the hard choices needed to stop wasteful spending, lower the national debt, and focus government on what matters most, protecting the nation. Now, protecting the nation sounds like a laudable goal, but in this case, there's a highly economic undertone to that. And that means that government is going to take a much more active role. And the vagueness of this and the implication that it means that government is going to be active in trying to create a number of conditions rather than just sitting back and letting people do things for themselves and then intervening when there is an actual demonstrable need to fix a real problem, means that government is not really focused on the protection of rights. And this is supposed to be the fundamental reason that government exists, is to protect the rights that people have and when they're in jeopardy. Otherwise, again, it's not supposed to play that active a role. Okay, next pillar, expanding economic growth and opportunity. The federal government cannot do this. Private business does this. This is a, at least ostensibly, free market economy nation. Not to mention the government is supposed to have widely limited powers, and that means that it does not play a role in expanding economic growth. More than that, the government is not a creator. Everything that it has either comes from taxpayers or is borrowed. It literally cannot create money. It has to take it from somewhere. So anything that it does means that it's taking something away from the private sector, which means it's actually limiting growth. So even if the federal government is starting programs that incentivize economic growth, it's not a net positive because the money it's using has been taken out of the economy to begin with. And part of expanding economic growth and opportunity, according to the president, is targeting unnecessary regulations for elimination. This is something the president has touted a lot. He signed an executive order shortly after taking office, which mandated that for every regulation passed by Congress, 2 would have to be eliminated. Now, the problem with this, and this sounds conservative and it sounds good, and yes, clearly we have too many regulations, but the idea that for every regulation we pass, we cut some, that is assuming there's some sort of morality inherent to numericism, and that's not true. There are good regulations. There are not a lot of good regulations, but there are some good regulations. And so to just say, well, we're going to pass 1 and cut 2, we're not looking at the quality of laws that we're passing and regulations that we're passing, and that's a problem. But beyond that, the president doesn't have a real aversion to regulation. He supports regulation for projects that he supports, such as the infrastructure bill. That's going to create a ton of new regulation. It's really only regulation that he doesn't like that he's opposed to. And again, the problem with that is it means that government is hinging on the president's will, which means it's not really limited. Okay, so the next pillar is preserving peace through strength. And this gets to, typical populist nationalism. We need to rebuild the military. And the budget, he says, does this in a number of ways by providing resources to enhance missile defense and to build planes, tanks, warships, and cyber tools. Most importantly, he says, the budget provides funds to increase the size of our armed forces and to give our men and women in uniform a well-earned pay raise. Then he goes on to say that the budget recognizes that we must definitely employ all of our tools of statecraft, diplomatic, intelligence-related, military, and economic, to compete and advance American influence. Okay, the inclusion of economic power along with military strength and with diplomacy, again, is troubling because it means that the government is playing an active role in the economy in an area where it's not meant to have any real power. Beyond that, it's now pursuing economic regulations with a specific goal in mind, which is its idea of what promotes American strength. And this does not allow individuals who work in separate sectors to define their own idea of economic good and what's in the benefit of their interest, because they're going to have to fit into what the overarching government idea of economic good in its relationship to national security is. So again, here we have a government that's unbounded and that is playing an active role in defining what good is for its citizens, which takes away from the power of individuals to be autonomous and to not only pursue that good in their own lives, but to define it as well. Again, this is upending the traditional American view of government and the relationship between government and the people. Next pillar is related to immigration. This is fairly typical Trump rhetoric: building the wall, dismantling transnational criminal organizations, and enforcing our immigration laws. Enforcing immigration laws, obviously, rule of law is a value that we should place supremacy on, but enforcing rule of law is more of a neutral action. It's just enforcing the law in every context. Actively seeking out and pursuing specific groups, including transnational criminal organizations, by which he means MS-13, is a little more difficult. And certainly if there's criminality that's going on in the United States, it should be put a stop to, because it means that the rule of law is not being obeyed. That's a little different than actively seeking to dismantle, especially transnational criminal organizations, which again gets to the idea that government is not that limited. We should be focused on enforcing the rule of law, but anything beyond that becomes kind of difficult to engage with, because then again it becomes a matter of people's discretion and you're empowering various government officials to make choices that they really shouldn't be making in the first place, because it's hard to have rule of law when government officials have power to make value judgments. Rebuilding our infrastructure is the next pillar. This gets this whole $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill that came out, the details of which are not entirely clear. Where the funding is coming from, it's coming from the incentivization of state and local projects to some degree, but exactly what the funding mechanisms are going to be is unclear. Again, this is government meddling in state and local politics in the name of federalism, which is the real problem with it. Essentially, they're touting the idea that, oh, we're going to incentivize state and local governments to act, we're empowering states. This is federalism, but this is not true, because it is coming at the end of a barrel of a government gun. Government is using force, government is setting the priorities which states and localities must meet if they want federal funding. So essentially, this is government strong-arm tactics. It is not actually federalism. And redefining that to mean federalism is a problem, and again limits the ability of non-federal constituency groups to have autonomy over their own lives. The next pillar is supporting American working families. All right, again, we're getting to the issue of government force dressed up as federalistic choice. The president writes that the budget reflects the importance of investing in American working families by making paid family leave available to new parents, investing in effective approaches to skills training like formal apprenticeships, and maintaining federal funding and leveraging additional state dollars for programs that help Americans' working families access and afford child care. So, a couple of issues with that. This emphasis on paid family leave and on skills training programs like apprenticeships means, again, that the government is inserting itself into what should be the private sphere. It's issuing directives and regulations, by the way. You've noticed that there's no talk of getting rid of regulations now, because this is stuff that the president likes. So we're creating new regulations, new directives that take away the power of companies and workers to negotiate on their own behalfs directly with their employers things that are going to benefit them. Instead, you're having the federal government telling employers, you must do this, which is taking away the autonomy of business. Not only that, but when he says leverage additional state dollars, I'm not sure whether he means state as in the federal government, but if this is state meaning actual states, then again, we're returning to this issue of the federal government strong-arming states into doing things that it wants in the name of their own benefit, again, preventing them from being able to define what's in their own good, which again hollows out the definition of federalism. The next couple of things, we have protecting our veterans. And this is kind of hard to find a problem with because you can't argue that veterans have gotten a raw deal in this country, that the VA is in a shambles, and that we really ought to help those who have sacrificed for the freedom of the nation. Again, there's vagueness here. Just throwing money at programs is not the answer. Whether or not the federal government is best poised to do this, whereas various veterans interest groups are more qualified, is questionable. This is a discussion that needs to occur, I think, in communities. It's a laudable pursuit. Whether or not the actual realities of it bear out is another question. Then we get to combating opioid addiction and fighting high medical drug prices. Now, the opioid epidemic is clearly something that's real and clearly is something that's a problem. What the federal government is going to do about it is harder to see. The president touts that he's declared a nationwide public health emergency. This is largely a symbolic gesture, and it doesn't do anything to address the problem. The government doesn't really have the resources to address the problem or the powers. This seems something that medical professionals in communities who are familiar with patients, who are familiar with on-the-ground situations, are better poised to do. Beyond that, again, this is something that is not within the purview of the enumerated powers given to the federal government in the Constitution. Fighting high medical drug prices is the same thing. And here's an issue where regulation is already part of the problem. The federal takeover of healthcare, the inability to do things like purchase insurance across state lines, price controls that the federal government mandates on drugs. Government intervention is the problem. More government intervention is not going to solve the problem. And again, as with opioid addiction, the government doesn't have any real power. It seized power to act in this behalf, but it doesn't have any actual legitimate claim to do this. The next pillar, moving from welfare to work, this deals with welfare reform and specifically creating more work requirements to qualify for welfare programs. The president writes that welfare reform must also protect public resources for the truly needy, especially the low-income elderly, children, and Americans with disabilities. So here we have the president saying, well, we need to reform welfare, but there are these people who need it. And that's probably true, but again, we're right back to the issue of the president's will dictating how government policy is going to be instituted. The president has identified certain groups that he thinks are deserving of welfare and others who he thinks are not as deserving of welfare. So we have the problem of the president making value judgments and this influencing policy, and this makes rule of law much more difficult to achieve and kind of negates the idea that all citizens exist at a parity before government. The second to last pillar is more pathways for affordable education and well-paying jobs. Again, we're right back to this issue of exactly what does the government think it has the power to do, and why does it think it's more qualified than private companies who work within the quickly changing economy to solve them. The budget, according to the president, takes important steps to expand opportunities for Americans to access affordable, employment-relevant education that puts them on a path to a well-paying job and ultimately a fulfilling career. Who is the government to make these kind of determinations? More than that, the president writes, the budget promotes formal apprenticeships, an evidence-based system that allows individuals to earn while they learn, and it makes important investments in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This is STEM education, and supports career and technical education in high schools and post-secondary institutions. Again, we get back to the free market. If these programs are that beneficial to the workforce, if they're that desirable, if training is needed, then the private sector is going to make accommodations to ensure that this happens. And they're going to do so from a position where they're much more familiar with the on-the-ground situations of different businesses, where they're much more familiar with the particular needs of individual businesses, where they're much more familiar with trends in business and where things are likely to go, meaning that they're in a much better position to connect with people who they think will actually help them. Also meaning that the particulars of education, they're in a much better position to know exactly what this is going to entail. The president and federal agencies are not. Again, whether or not they have this authority is highly questionable. And again, you have the president making decisions for companies about what's in the best interest of their business, and this again takes away from individual ability to define and pursue good for the self. And the final pillar is promoting school choice. This is a laudable goal. Again, not sure that it's something the federal government should do so much as states and localities, because they're more familiar with on-the-ground situations and are better to tailor educational environments to individuals who are best suited for them. So the president concludes that he basically just outlines that these are his priorities, and he writes in conclusion, it is now up to the Congress to act. I pledge my full cooperation in unleashing the incredible and unparalleled potential of the American people. There is no limit to the promise of America when we keep our commitments to our fellow Americans and continue to put their interests first. Working together, we will do just that. Again, this just reiterates this whole nationalist populist sentiment and this America First sentiment. And I don't think America First is necessarily a problem. Every person in every nation in the world should believe that their country of residence is the best and provides for them, and believe that the national interest is their own interest. There's a big difference here, though, between this idea that the government is actively pursuing your interest and defining your interest and working together with you to achieve that. And part of this, the problem with this is that if we're working together, well, we can't really work together because there's a power imbalance between the federal government and the individual. And if the federal government is making decisions about how or exactly what interest is and how it can be achieved, that is directly taking power away from the individual. To do that, they then have to comply to a certain degree with what the government is doing. And if they don't, then they're not going to receive the same benefits as those who go along are. So again, we're truncating individual liberty. And that really, I think, is the problem with this whole budget, as it is predicated on this notion that the government is empowered to act for the public good. And as we've discussed here before, there really is no such thing as the public good. There's the individual good, and this is what America is founded on, the idea that there are many individual goods and people are not only entitled to, but are rational actors who can seek and pursue this for themselves. And the attitudes and the specific policy prescriptions in this government just totally undercut that notion.